Okay. I guess I'll shut up and let you teach.
All right. Well, I was hoping to get to chapter 17, but I think we're just going to finish out 16. So the exam will be, just on unit 3 here, which is just chapters 14, 15, and 16, which quizzes for all of them except for 16 are up and should be available to you. Please let me know as soon as possible if you don't have those available. So we'll cover the rest of chapter 16 today. And let me get that up here for you. All right, does it appear?
Yes.
All right, so we finished off on Monday talking about sustainability, how that's becoming increasingly important, especially with a growing world population, trying to reduce inputs. And I really want to impress upon you all that the whole sustainability thing gets thrown around a lot in agriculture. It's almost like kind of a bad word. But really what I equate it to a lot of times, you have to look at the 3 pillars there. It is environmental sustainability, yes, but it's also social and economic sustainability. So really, if you think about it, we're trying to reduce inputs not just for the environmental aspect, but for the economic aspect as well. And of course, that affects the way that we manage soil, water, and nutrients. And really, I think the sustainable side of things, we're looking more at long-term practices. Although we have to look at both long and short-term practices. And again, that's going to depend on what the crop is and where it's being grown. What's your climate like? What's your microclimate like? So all of that will change depending on the production system. Let's talk about some of these environmental factors. First, light, which of course is very important because we have to have light for photosynthesis. We have to have light for crop production. And while there are some crops that can be produced with lower light conditions, generally we want to try to maximize light. So one of the things that we look at is the way that we orient our rows and space plants between each other so that they have the maximum light penetrating and have the maximum photosynthesis. The way that you would orient rows is going to kind of vary with your latitude as well as the season. And generally, we try to think of kind of like a more of a passive solar alignment to where you're getting the maximum light throughout the day and throughout the growing season.
Turn it down.
So generally, we would kind of orient our rows north to south. So that you're getting the maximum light conditions. Of course, that's for our area, our latitude. Higher latitudes, it would be oriented differently. So that crops are not shading each other out. Of course, the spacing is a big deal as well. We want to maximize spacing to get the most efficiency for crops.
What I get.
So generally for efficiency, we're looking at almost touching for crop canopy. So we're getting a good density of plants as well as the maximum light. As you know, the planting dates are going to depend on the crop itself and where you're growing it, what the microclimate is like. Talk about harvest for a little bit. So we've produced a crop, but then we also have to harvest it, and this is where there's a really huge input of labor often in harvesting, and it's different for every crop. So here they've got some cranberry production where they actually flood the field so that the cranberries float to the top and are easier to harvest. So it's going to depend on the type of crop, how you will harvest it, whether it's mechanical or by hand. And during harvesting, it's the crop can be pretty susceptible to damage. So traditionally, almost all harvesting was done by hand, and to this day, most vegetable and fruit crops are still harvested by hand, and pretty much all of the cut floral crops. We have some mechanical implements that will aid harvest, but in many of these cases, it still has to be done by hand. So in some cases, especially in really important agricultural areas, it depends on migrant labor for harvesting. Of course, we have mechanized harvesting for pretty much all of our commodity, subsidized crops. In this case, cotton. We've got a large combine harvester pictured here, as well as all of our grain crops. Of course, this greatly reduces the need for human labor at harvest. Here's harvest of a corn crop. And in many cases, this can reduce the need for fuel sources, although in some cases it can also increase the need for fuel, depending on really the technology of that mechanization. So this is mostly for crops that are intended for processing. So the fresh market crops themselves are still harvested by hand in order to limit the injury. In some cases, there have been mechanical pickers that are able to limit injury for particular crops, like pictured here for sweet corn. There is a mechanical harvester out there, although a lot of it is still picked by hand. Same case here, we've got a mechanical harvester of lettuce. And we often think of these mechanical harvesters mostly just on a large scale, but lately there have been a lot of technological advancements and engineering that has led to some more smaller scale mechanical harvesting. Like leaf lettuce, there's a really simple machine that's operated by a drill that basically does the same thing that's happening in the picture to the left. On the right there, though, of course, we still have a lot of it picked by hand. Here's an image of a machine that is designed not to harvest the crops themselves, but to further process them. So this is for cut flowers, and this will strip leaves, trim stems. In the cases of roses, it removes most of the thorns as well, and can even sort flowers by size and quality. With the advent of modern technology, we have sensors that really improve harvest efficiency, as well as GPS that allows field equipment to really be controlled precisely and programmed to where it does exactly what you want to. Of course, as we know, with a lot of computer technology, it still depends on the operator to give it the correct programming. So we have a lot of potential for operator error in these things as well. And that's where, training comes in handy, and just knowing the technology. So what do some of these sensors do? Well, there's some that actually are sensing the yields, and if we have a lower yield, it can increase the speed at which it's actually harvesting. We have moisture sensors that basically will skip over crops if they're too moist, especially in the case of grain, or if they're too dry. And also other sensors for just the maximum flavor profile, but basically the best crop value that you can get. So We might look at things by color or appearance, or by weight or volume, all kinds of different sensors that can do these different things. So let's say we've harvested it. What happens next? Of course, there's a lot to do with the post-harvest handling. Of course, we think back in time, the ability to store food has been critical for the development of human societies. And I mean, you might not think of that as being that important, but it really is. You can grow a crop, but if you can't store it, then why does it matter? So life in North America and Europe would have been impossible without this ability to store food for winter. Many different ways that we do that. Of course, with transportation, we're able to move things great distances. In many cases, a lot of our fresh vegetables are coming from these areas where they're best produced and travel all over the country and all over the world. In some cases, thousands of miles. And then particular crops require specific attention for post-harvest handling as well. And to this day, even with the advent of modern technology, we still have a lot of crop losses post-harvest. So that's an area of agriculture that is still being improved upon and needs a lot of attention. If we could limit post-harvest deterioration, then that would really be a boon to increasing the world's food supply and decreasing hunger, and really increasing the bottom line for farmers. This chart is just showing, when you're harvesting crops, whether the plant is mature or immature when it's harvested. Of course, that depends on the crop. So what happens for deterioration? Why do we have these losses after harvest? Well, there are many different reasons. Of course, we have biological deterioration itself. And they say as soon as you harvest something, it begins to decompose pretty much. A lot of the nutrient content begins to deteriorate, and that's just due to those metabolic processes continuing after the crop is harvested. We also have physical deterioration, and that's usually dealing with damage, which can occur even if you're harvesting the whole plant. All kinds of ways that we can have damage. So anytime that we're separating mechanically or by hand this fragile crops, especially like the fresh market fruits, they're susceptible to damage. So in many cases, we actually take advantage of just the natural separation, the abscission of the crop from the mature plant. And that occurs at these abscission zones where we really look at that hormone that we talked about earlier in class. Abscisic acid is basically utilized at that point on the plant. So these abscission zones are usually kind of on the fruit stems or pedicels, as well as the ovary walls and placentas of the plants themselves. And we can promote abscission through the application of abscisic acid and other growth regulators. In some cases, though, we might want to try to delay abscission. So again, there are growth regulators that can be used for that. We talked early on about the whole idea of shattering, and that's how grain crops were selected and how really agriculture started in many respects, was for that mutation to where the stem held on to, they didn't abscess from the plant on the grain, so that we could actually harvest that whole stem and then later separate the grain from the stem through a process known as threshing, which is a forceful process. We're actually and kind of intentionally damaging the stem so we can separate the edible part from the non-edible part. And in this process, it can lead to infestation of different pests and potentially a reduction in quality and value. Of course, there are other cases where we harvest them when the abscission zone is not fully developed, which would require us to, cut or break that area, which then results in a wound area. For example, if you think about like okra, for instance, we're not harvesting it when the fruit itself is mature. We're harvesting it when it's immature because that's when it is the most edible. So we have to actually cut it. And in doing so, we're actually causing some physical damage. And in many respects, that's just unavoidable. But there are things that we can do to prevent further deterioration. So one thing, pictured here, just that one thing that we do with cut flowers and potted ornamentals is place them in protective sleeves, like it's pictured here with the poinsettias for shipping. These sleeves are designed so that they will still allow air exchange and prevent the buildup of ethylene, which would, of course, cause deterioration. So it's all about the design of the packaging, handling, and transport systems. We need to try to make them to where they're minimizing that damage. And of course, it does still, even with technology, it remains a major cause of crop loss. If we're harvesting seed itself, if we don't put in the proper harvest and post-harvest measures in place, then they can lose their ability to germinate over time. And that's mostly due just to subtle changes in the cell structure and genetic material of the plant. For food crops, that deterioration is often associated not necessarily just with the damage itself, but other areas that could lead to off flavors or in some case even make it inedible completely. Think about, potatoes here, and we're talking about sprouting of potatoes here, but also if you have like greening of potatoes, you have to store them in darkness. If you have light applied to them, then you get that greening, and that greening actually signifies the presence of a toxic chemical. So really you can't sell green potatoes because even though you can remove that, it's a less desirable product. Usually we're harvesting a lot of different immature structures, and we're not waiting for them to get to that peak mature stage, because at that point they're not as good. For instance, in peas or sweet corn or green onions, well, not green onions as much, but definitely peas and sweet corn, if you wait later, then they develop fibers, and in the case of sweet corn, this sugars turn into starches. So these are extremely perishable crops. So what do? We try to interrupt the kind of post-harvest maturation process, try to interrupt that metabolism so that we don't have spoilage as much. And usually what happens here with spoilage, we'll see things like yellowing or premature senescence in these crops. As we talked about before, in many cases we actually use ethylene to hasten the ripening of some crops. Like tomatoes and bananas, we often pick them green and then gas them with ethylene so that they continue to mature off the plant. Insects can also be a big problem for post-harvest deterioration, especially in grain crops, and also in seeds too. And in many cases with seeds, what I like to do, if I have room anyway, if I'm saving seed, I found that it's best to put it in a freezer for long enough to destroy any potential insects that might have been in there. I learned that the hard way. The pictured here on the left is a type of weevil, and these weevils do lots of damage to seeds if they are left present in the crop. So I once harvested a bunch of October beans, saved for seed, and this is before I really knew about the whole weevil situation. Didn't really think about it and go to plant them in the spring, open the box up, and the weevils had eaten through pretty much every seed. So this is also kind of interesting. They say in India, for instance, where there's a lot of vegetarians, they actually get a good amount of their protein from insects that are in the grain crops. It sounds kind of gross, but it's true. Another issue, of course, fungi can attack any kind of crop, and we want to try to alter that post-harvest environment to make it to where it is not conducive to fungal infestations. Because in many cases it is. Cool and moist tends to promote a lot of fungal growth. So, but you could potentially alter that by a few degrees in order to prevent a lot of fungal growth. So some of these that I'm sure you've seen before include botrytis and penicillium. These are often known as molds, but technically they're still fungi. So let's talk about quality for a minute. The quality itself is dependent upon the purpose of the crop itself. So for most crops out there, there is a kind of market quality standard that is set by the USDA or other bodies, kind of third parties that influence these quality standards. Generally, we're looking at size, shape, color, and we have a grading level based on that. Try to maximize nutritional content as well. Some of it I think is kind of arbitrary and kind of silly. For instance, in bell peppers, grade A requires them to have 4 lobes on the pepper itself. So if you have an off type, it could be perfectly fine otherwise, but if it has 3 lobes, then it doesn't fit into grade A, and then we call that a second. And seconds, although they may be fine to consume, you can't get as much money off of them because they're not grade A. They're grade B or C. So there are inspectors to actually look and make sure that crops achieve quality standards. And as you know, nutritional quality is a big deal, and often is looked at as more of an issue. More recently, I think people are more aware of the nutritional information. So in some cases, especially if there's any processing taking place, there has to be nutrition facts listed on processed crops, and they have to also, adhere to these nutritional standards. So on large scale processed crops, there are inspectors and there are, very stringent standards. To this day, pesticide poisoning from commercially produced food is rare as we know it now, although we have seen some studies that are looking at that. I think that some pesticide residues might actually be causing other things that we didn't intend, not direct poisoning, but more like chronic exposure. Some researchers think that like gluten intolerance, for instance, might be caused more by pesticide residue. So there are very few, if almost no pesticide direct poisonings, but there might be some indirect issues caused from pesticides. Of course, as we talked about a little bit last week, we can have harmful organisms getting into the food supply as well, with E. coli and salmonella outbreaks. And a big thing that we've kind of put in place to try to prevent that is we call the GAPS, or good agricultural practices. A lot of times, these are sometimes due to bulk handling and the wide distribution methods of our modern crop marketing that allows them to be vulnerable to the spread of a lot of these organisms. So microbial food safety is a huge issue and is becoming more and more important, and it causes us to view certain crops totally differently, and causes some people to completely alter the way that they market these crops. I think romaine lettuce has had a large blow dealt to it. Still can't find romaine lettuce in the store, and I think people are going to be afraid of romaine for a while because of one big outbreak. This might seem kind of silly, but there was a big outbreak in green onions back in the early 2000s, and I think Taco Bell was affected by it. They had a couple of food poisoning cases, and because of that, they don't use green onions anymore. So, and if you think about it, really, green onions, romaine lettuce, a lot of fresh greens, it makes sense because there are so many cracks and crevices. It's really hard to clean and sterilize, and it's really easy for there to be spots for these bacteria to occur and have habitat. Another big issue that I think really affects post-harvest crop loss is just the consumer satisfaction and the consumer standards. So often these are more kind of subjective quality attributes, deal more with the aesthetics, the form and the color, and sometimes also the scent or aroma, what we expect it to be like. And I think that, that changes from generation to generation, of course, but, we want that bell pepper to look a particular way. We want our, what we buy in the store to be blemish-free. So often we call these hedonic factors or attributes, and that's just because they are subjective, and it's something that humans really assign, consumers assign, rather than necessarily just a regular standard. And I think really this depends upon your audience. Who is your consumer? If you're selling wholesale, then you really don't have control over that. If you're selling direct to your consumer, then you do have a direct impact on that subjective quality, and you can influence some of these standards. Looking at post-harvest treatments, these are just any specific measures that are taken to try to maintain the crop quality from harvest to sell, harvest to table, pretty much. So in some cases, we have a curing period that allows wounds from harvesting to heal, like in potatoes, onions, winter squash, garlic. We give this a period of time to where the wounds are actually sealed. That's still, even though it's harvested, you might have removed a lot of the material from the plant itself. It's still maturing. There's still a metabolic process taking place there. For seed and for grain crops, we have to have low moisture content. And generally, we're looking at, under 10%. For moisture content, and for seeds, in some cases, under or around 5% moisture. And if that moisture content is over 13%, in some cases they actually use hot air to try to dry them. And there are some chemical treatments out there as well that to prevent some types of deterioration. not widely used and really not approved by the FDA, but irradiation in some cases has been advocated for as a replacement for some of these chemical treatments. Sounds kind of scary to me. Heat treatment is also being looked at and is used in some cases for insect and fungus control in many fruits and vegetables. For any of you all that eat apples, pretty much all of our apples on the market are waxed, oiled or waxed, so that it makes them look shinier and prettier, but it also reduces the moisture loss, can prevent some of the ethylene off gassing too. So they hold better for longer. And I don't know, I eat a lot of apples myself, but personally, I don't really like the idea of eating wax too, but that's just a kind of a consumer standard that we've come to embrace. What are you going to do about it? Buy direct from the producer. In some cases, there are still, more underdeveloped regions of the world where they still store produce, crops under leaves or in the ground, in dug pits, and sometimes in heaps on the ground. So if you think about it, that's how we first stored a lot of this produce, just using the earth as a way to kind of cool it and keep it out of the sun. So most grain today, of course, is stored in silos, and use grain elevators in order to transport them. Cooling is a huge part of post-harvest handling, which is meant to slow down the respiration and those metabolic processes in crops, and in some cases also remove or affect and slow down the pests and pathogens that affect them, to delay deterioration. In some cases, we're looking at the freezing point, especially for temperate crops, and we will actually store them, right around 32 degrees or just below that. However, in a lot of tropical crops, they can be injured below 50 degrees. So it depends on the crop, where it's coming from. Field heat is one of the big reasons why we need to do some cooling. Basically, field heat is just that heat that is accumulated on the crop throughout days. Heat does accumulate, even though the air temperature could be lower, the crop surface could be warmer. And because of that, we have to remove that field heat. If we don't remove the field heat, then they can continue to deteriorate, and pretty quickly, really. So for that reason, we often try to harvest a lot of crops, especially like leafy greens and herbs, when the temperatures are naturally lower, where that field heat has not yet accumulated. So we do that in the early mornings or sometimes later in the evenings. But, on a large scale, that's not really practical. So in that case, we often have mobile coolers to place the crop into cooling pretty much immediately after it's harvested. Hydro cooling is, one of the easiest and most practical ways to remove this field heat. And generally, we look at it as really just washing the crop. And in this way, you can do some cleaning and cooling at the same time. Again, it's kind of more practical on a small scale. Can be done to some extent on a large scale, but often hydro cooling is done on a smaller scale. So you harvest it and pretty quickly try to get it into water, cool water, right? Or, even if it's lukewarm, it's going to be often better than, the summer air temperature. Many different ways to cool items, cool rooms, and I know a lot of small-scale growers around here that have basically, gotten trailers, truck trailer, and basically gotten put cooling systems into the trailer so that that's where they store their produce until they're able to get it to market in a refrigerated room. There's also forced air cooling for more delicate crops. And air cooling can be better than water cooling, and one of the big reasons is because it avoids the spread of pathogens. Water quality is really important for if you're doing any type of water, any washing or hydrocooling. And in some cases, especially for temperate crops, we might actually pack the crops in ice in order to get that cooling, like for broccoli, for instance. Vacuum cooling is kind of like the opposite of forced air. Instead of forcing that air onto it, it kind of sucks it out and often kind of seals it in containers. Again, this is mostly done more on a large scale. We have moisture loss is going to happen naturally. We want to try to prevent that because even a loss of 5% of the fresh weight can result in wilting or shriveling and causing that crop to be unsellable. So usually what we do to maintain moisture is add humidifiers or just harvest it at the optimum humidity. Refrigeration itself is going to slightly reduce humidity because cooler air holds less moisture. So dehydration, while again not practical on an extremely large scale unless that's what you're selling is dehydrated crops, it can be a way to preserve many crops for really long periods of time. And in this way, when you're intentionally dehydrating them, you're not damaging them through the removing of water because it's happening on a quicker scale. With dehydration, it will basically cause the decay-causing organisms to not be able to grow, especially if you're at a moisture of 15% or lower. Here's just a pretty poor image here of some solar dehydration occurring right in the field. Of course, you can only do this in, bright, dry areas, often in more arid parts of the country and world. Often this is done more for fruit crops. Forced air dehydration is just another way to do it, and talking about moving warm or hot air around the crop to dehydrate it. And of course, you may have done this at home using a home dehydrator. Again, it's processing, so it's not often done. I mean, for a lot of different produce, it's not done at all for fresh market stuff, right? Because it is processing. You can also do freeze drying, which is basically dehydration through sublimation. Sublimation is just this process where ice passes directly to a vapor without going through the liquid phase. So it's expensive to do, but it is done, and I think that's really mostly for specialized markets. Kind of a newer type of dehydration is not really dehydrating the crop so much, but just dehydrating the air around it. And we call this controlled atmosphere storage or controlled environment storage. And this is often done for fruit crops. But basically, we're just lowering the oxygen and replacing that oxygen with nitrogen in these chambers. Again, that's going to reduce the oxygen to where pathogens cannot grow. Got any canners out there? Well, canning, of course, is also a way to remove spoilage organisms, and we do that through heat. But in doing so, you're actually also kind of cooking a little bit and altering the form of the produce. Generally, it's done with something else, unless you're doing like pressure canning. Most canning, you're adding something in there. So in the case of like a lot of fruit products, we do that with sugar. We add sugar to it to increase the osmotic pressure to the levels where the water is unavailable to the microbes and reduces spoilage, jams, jellies, etc. We can also process with salt in a brine, usually what we kind of consider more like pickles, but there is also some things that we do for like lacto fermentation, where we're using lactic acid, which lowers the pH and prevents the growth of organisms other than the bacteria that produces the lactic acid. Of course, sauerkraut is an excellent example of that. There seems to be kind of a trend around this lacto fermentation. Ethylene, as we've mentioned before, is this natural plant hormone that is given off by the harvested crops. It comes from these climacteric fruits that continue to ripen off of the plant, and it continues to cause senescence. So ethylene can be a good thing, can be a bad thing. So in some cases we want to remove ethylene, some cases we want to add it. Ethylene will cause like sprouting of things like potatoes and onions. It can cause flowers to senesce. So those cases we would want to remove it. In the cases of like tomatoes or bananas, again, we want to add it so that they continue to ripen. We're just going to touch on marketing for a second, mostly because I know you guys deal with this quite a bit in your agribusiness class. But just thinking about marketing through time, primitive societies had little or no marketing. When barter systems and money exchange developed, then there had to be some sort of marketing. So today, of course, it's a huge deal. And one of the big things that we have to think about, again, is that we try to produce crops in the area where they are best produced, where it's the most efficient. And then we transport them around the country and around the world. So like all of our tree fruits, almonds, like let's say like 98% of the almonds produced in the United States come from this particular area of the Central Valley of California. A lot of our fresh fruits come from there as well. Tomatoes often come from there, or Mexico or Florida. The areas where they are best produced and then transported. Of course, as this understanding of sustainability increases, and really I think food security as well, the whole local grown trend is, has become this really attractive marketing strategy. And one way of kind of doing this marketing, direct to consumer marketing, community supported agriculture, a CSA system, usually where someone subscribes to a share of crops and you provide them with a box every week or so, whatever your subscription is based on. So CSAs are, I think, a unique method of marketing. Look real quickly here at the process of marketing. We look at assembly, where basically we're concentrating the small quantities of the crop itself. Exchange, where we're basically moving it from buyers to sellers, or sellers to buyers, etc. Possibly directly to the consumer. Financing, which basically we're just talking about the exchange to money, pretty much. And I think that the financing, it's a necessary evil, but I want to say this is one reason why we have this issue in Virginia anyway, and it's different in different parts of the country, but in Virginia, we say that less than 16 cents of every consumer dollar spent on food actually goes to the farmer, mostly due to these middlemen through the process of marketing. They have to get paid too, right? Then, of course, there are commodity markets and exchanges where these prices are really governed by the market itself, the supply and demand. You don't really have any say in what your pricing is in these cases. And in some cases, really most cases, there's some government intervention in these markets, especially for commodities and subsidized crops. That can change even on a daily basis, though. So some knowledge of these markets are really important if you are growing commodified crops. And a potential option is agricultural cooperatives, and today there are also things they call food hubs, which are similar but kind of they're both on kind of nonprofit basis, where there's a body that basically conglomerates the produce and then sells it together. One of the best examples of this, probably most well-known examples, is Ocean Spray, a co-op of all these different fruit growers that then process it into juice together and sell it under one label. Of course, we have a lot of producers, especially on the small scale, that also sell directly to the customer. Always think about whether you're looking at a wholesale or retail operation. That can really affect your production system and your site selection. And as you all know, did a little bit of agritourism research there. This is actually a huge area of agriculture that is growing. Not just selling the product itself, but providing some sort of entertainment as well. And finally, let's just look at internet marketing here. Really growing in a way to potentially market crops. I would recommend everybody has a good grasp of that. Whether it is actually for the exchange or the direct sales of the plants or the products from the plants, or just aiding some information in the search from buyers and sellers. And finally, storage, of course, extremely important part of the marketing system. And that is it. We didn't get that in time, but does anybody have any questions, comments, or concerns there before I let you guys go for the last time?
Yeah, I had one about my crop project, because I'm doing a harder crop that's not, I'm doing cannabis, as you know, and there's not very many scholarly articles yet.
Right.
That I can find. So would you just want me to give you as much information as I can?
Yeah, I would say look at as much information, and you might be surprised. There actually, it just depends on where you're looking. Try Google Scholar too.
Well, I just used the school website first and really didn't find anything used.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I'll look. There's books and stuff that you can get good information about, like the propagation and stuff. So I can find good information about that, but just like a scholarly article, at least through using the school website, probably.
Right. Yeah. I check Google Scholar, and if you continue to have trouble, I'll say on the peer-reviewed articles, as long as you just cite a little bit of information out of those, I just want to see that you guys are able to, take kind of these more scientific sources if they're out there. I might be able to help you find some though, but just let me know if you're having trouble with it. If you guys cannot find peer-reviewed articles on particular as a source for particular crops, then I'm not going to look at it with a fine-tooth comb. And as long as you have the information and complete the project, I'll grade it fairly.
I had a follow-up where you talked about direct-to-consumer, and Megan, this really goes to you and your marketing project. Next Wednesday, I know it's their exam week, but next Wednesday, the Virginia Cooperative Extension Service is doing a Virginia Market Ready farm-to-restaurant workshop on our Keysville campus. If
that's cool.
You're going, let me know, because the Agribusiness Foundation will pay your registration fee thing. But they talk about the strategies and stuff for partnering up with the restaurant as far as you're growing your vegetables, you partner with a restaurant, so they're serving your locally homegrown vegetables, that kind of thing. Just use that as an example. It's like 9 o'clock next Wednesday, December 12th, in the Keysville campus. But it covers a lot of the stuff that some of we talked about in marketing class, some of it you just talked about in the last few minutes.
I wish I could come to that.
You can. I'll email you the flyer. Just call and sick. You look like you're gonna be sick next Wednesday.
Yeah, I would say that's huge. For our produce business, I mean, selling to restaurants was extremely important for us. If we hadn't made that connection, I don't know if we would have made it as long as we did. So, yeah.
My only problem is I'm going to be giving your plant science final during part of that. And my marketing final during part of that, so, oh well.
Sorry, Tom.
Scheduling, but it just sort of came together and happened, but there we go. But if you're interested, let me know as soon as possible. I'll try to send out the flyers to everybody in the next little bit.
And are you still going to put up the example of a PowerPoint?
Yeah, the crop project and the PowerPoint. I've almost got the PowerPoint finished, so I'll try to get that up today, but definitely before next week.
Right.
And you guys just, I also don't have the area to upload that up yet, but I'll also do that today, like right after class, so that you guys can upload your crop projects. If you guys have any questions about any of this, please just let me know.
Do you have a set due date on that yet?
The set due date is, let's see, what is our, the grades are due on the 19th.
No, the 17th, that Monday morning at 8 a.m., so.
Yeah, so they are due by Friday, 11:59. So Friday the 14th, crop projects in.
And I got everybody's grades for the pesticide applicators license test. I put those in for that plant lab grade, for that lab trip grade. And if y'all haven't finished those lab reports, you need to go ahead and knock those out too, because he needs to be grading them as well as your projects, as well as your exams, all that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, I would say anything left over by that Friday, 11:59 p.m., so we can get those grades in.
Yes, and the sooner the better. Okay, that's all I had.
Thank you. Y'all have a great day. Good luck on your finals.
Okay, like I said, you can shoot me the email with the password. Sure, that would be cool.
Okay.
Okay, bye everybody. See y'all. Remember, there's no animal science class, so see y'all, the marketing people in there.